Okay, so my name is Laurel Haak. I'm the Executive Director of Orchid, online researcher and contributor identifier system. And what I'm going to present today is a bit about where Orchid is in its development and what's available now to play with in the system and what Orchid is, as a matter of fact. So how many of you have actually heard of Orchid? Just raise your hands. Excellent. Okay, I have another question. I was out looking at the audience. I noticed a number of you have computers. I would like to know how many people in the audience wrote at least one paper in college using a pen. How many of you actually used a pen to write a paper? That's great. I don't feel so old. Thank you. Not everybody. That's great. I think that's just kind of part of this is, those of us who have been through a bit of the transition here, when I started college, the internet didn't really exist, at least for mortals like me. It's just kind of interesting to see how everything really has been transformed from looking in those fabulous little paper citation books where you're trying to find the paper to help you with your research. Now everything's online. And it really begs the question that you said is, how do we manage our identity in a world that's increasingly becoming digital? I'm going to give you a little bit about my background so you understand some of my perspective here, and then we'll go into this talk. So I have a degree in neuroscience. I've spent a fair amount of time working at a bench. I still publish papers and have spent also a fair amount of time in the research policy world, working both at AAAS and the national academies. Just prior to here, working at Orchid, I also worked at both a small and a large IT consulting firm. So I kind of understand this idea of how do we manage personal identifiers, but also why are we interested in personal identifiers? Because a lot of what I have been doing comes from the evaluator's perspective. We want to understand, we being a funding agency, let's say, the effectiveness of our grant programs. But it's really hard to understand that if we don't understand who's getting the funding, who's involved as collaborators in that funding, and how that funding has an impact on the science itself. And without understanding who the people are who are involved in doing the research, who they're talking to, and how this knowledge moves through that ecosystem, it's very, very difficult for those funding organizations to determine how effective their programs are and to tweak them. So, part of it is individual. How does an individual go out and market themselves in the world? But also, how do those funding organizations, how do the research organizations understand how best to concentrate or direct their resources to best effect? So that's another big reason to have something like Orchid out there. So what I'm going to cover today, what is Orchid, talk a little bit about nuts and bolts, who are our sponsors, a little bit about membership, very, very small, talk about our development schedule, some examples of how Orchid can be integrated, what kinds of places we see Orchid working, and some tools that are available now for those of us who like to play with code. So, Orchid, what is it? And why is it different from things that have been tried before in the personal space? So Orchid is an international, interdisciplinary, open and not-for-profit organization created for the benefit of all stakeholders, including, and you can see, research institutions, funders, individuals, publishers, and the list can go on. This is not a fully inclusive list. What we are trying to do with Orchid is to create a registry of persistent and unique identifiers for individuals, and in particular researchers and others in the research ecosystem. Okay? And not just to create that persistent identifier, but also to integrate that identifier into a number of research workflows. I think the big difference between Orchid and other systems that are out there are other systems do create persistent identifiers, but they work in a silo. And what Orchid is trying to do is break down those silos. It's not trying to get rid of the other identifier systems, it's trying to link them with each other. So if you have an identifier system, for example, in the NIH Commons database, you can now link your Orchid to that profile if you have, or that's an idea, if you have a RepHec ID, you can link that ID to your Orchid. Okay, so it's a way of kind of acting as a switchboard for all the identifier systems that are out there, and also because it's integrated in research workflows to automate the process of linking your identifier with the stuff you do in the research space. So, I'm publishing a paper. By including your Orchid in your author profile, when that paper is accepted and published, there is a linkage that's created between the Orchid and the DOI. It's automatic. You don't have to think about it. Just all you have to do is add your Orchid into your profile. Same thing with grants. You submit a grant, you include your ORCID in your grant profile. If that grant is awarded, there is then an automated linkage that happens between the grant and yourself. That information goes back to your ORCID record and can be picked up by other institutions that are interested in maintaining their own databases. The idea here is that by creating this switchboard that integrates in these workflows, you now have an ID that is live. It's alive. It's a living system. It's part of the ecosystem. It's not this dead thing that you forget to update. All right, so scope. So I've covered most of this. An ORCID record requires basic information. We're not asking for your date of birth. We're not asking for the first name of your father. It's very basic information, your name, your email, organization. And this can be enhanced with additional information, for example, your degree, digital objects, and other identifiers. Not only will ORCID link moving forward to research products and objects, but also can link backward. So you can, for example, by linking to an identifier like a Scopus ID, bring in your papers from the past. Okay, so it's a way of bringing all of that together. Records can be created both by individuals and organizations. Privacy is controlled by the individual. So if your organization creates a record for you, you still have to go in and claim the record for it to become public. Okay? And then finally, ORCID is an open initiative, and we will enable third parties to build value-added services. ORCID code is posted, and the APIs are posted and available through an open source license. So our goal is really to work with the community to develop the services that are needed. Okay, what I'm going to focus on today, I developed a set of slides that's focused on publishers. It doesn't mean there aren't a whole other bevy of benefits to ORCID. But for publishers and authors, benefits of ORCID is that it supports disambiguation of authors, and through that, tracking of authors within and across journals. Now, in its initial implementation, most publishers are talking about including an ORCID only for the corresponding author, and over time expanding that out for all of the authors on the paper. So that would mean every author in the paper would have an ORCID. That ORCID would be communicated. Other systems would then be able to bring in that ORCID in those author publication pairs. By including your ORCID, there's also the possibility of bringing in information from your ORCID record to help populate the form for manuscript submission. So it could potentially speed up manuscript submission. By automating the linkage between authors and their publications, it can reduce reporting burden for authors, right? If the institution uses a feed from ORCID to update its local systems, you can now have, let's say, your Vivo profile updated by a feed from ORCID. Or when you're applying for a grant, you can use your ORCID record to help fill in the essential components of your grant application. So there are a lot of things ORCID can do to help speed up basic form filling. By creating or supporting, actually, the community understanding of who's working with whom on what papers, you can also support the peer review process and make it easier to find folks to do review. And there also are some conversations ongoing right now talking about could ORCID play a role in conflict of interest reporting by providing a linkage between some of the systems that hold that information. So these are, obviously ORCID's not live. These are possibilities. These are things to explore, and I think some very real opportunities for ORCID to play in the community. So who is ORCID? Right now it's a board and me and a technical director just kind of come on Monday next week. But we also have 328 participating organizations. These are organizations who have contacted ORCID and have signed up to say we are interested. 50 of those organizations have provided sponsorship funding to help us get off the ground and running. And we will make our membership terms available on Friday this week. So we are moving from actually into being real. So I'm very, very excited about this. We'll have more information on our website about membership. Okay, what is ORCID? What's part of phase one? What will be available this year? and what is available now. So what Orchid is this year is a self-claim delegated management system that also allows for institutional seeding of data. So institutions can create records this year. Orchid provides fine-grained control of privacy settings for the individual, and institutions that seed data, if they're, well, they can also set privacy as well, but again, ultimately that rests in the hands of the individual. There is data exchange into grant and manuscript submission systems supported by our APIs, as well as integration with other ID profile systems such as Scopus, RepHack, Researcher ID, and Vivo. And then finally, we have the ability to support the identifier resolution and metadata search. Okay? So that's the phase 1 system. So what do we mean by APIs? There's a two-tiered API. There's a tier 1 API that is freely available. This service can be used by individuals and organizations to query and retrieve public data from Orchid. It can be used without any registration or configuration. Okay, now what I mean by public data is data that has been marked as publicly available by the individual holding the record. Okay? Tier 2 service is intended for those third parties who need to query and retrieve data, add or update profile data, and require production level integration, including authentication. Okay, so the tier 2 service requires membership in Orchid. So I think what you can see here is that if you are an individual and you would like an Orchid, you can register for free. If you want to manage your Orchid record, that will be for free. If you are submitting a publication, you can, that linkage between, for you as an individual, you don't have to pay anything to link to the to that publication record. That will be automatically updated. Your record will be automatically updated. However, that organization that wishes to use that authentication piece will have to pay a membership to be able to do that. All right. So 2012, in May, actually a couple weeks ago, we had already released the APIs, but we provided a sandbox server for third parties, anybody who's interested in testing integration with either one of the APIs. That's actually available now, and I'll provide you a URL a little bit later on in the talk. What we expect fall Q4 this year, phase 1.1, is a more fully featured system with more testing of the APIs. And I don't want to say a whole lot about this. Our technical director, as I said, is our full-time formal person, is going to be taking over from Jeff Builder, who's done a marvelous job to date. She's starting on Monday, and the week after that, we're actually going to be meeting with our developers, one of whom is sitting right over there, to spec out what's actually going to be released this fall. So there'll be more information about the launch schedule and what will be included in the launch a little bit later this month. Okay, so watch our website. So this is our timeline. You can see we're kind of at the edge of Q2 here. We have built phase 1.0 that's been released with the sandbox server. We're in the process of building phase 1.1, scoping that out. And as you can see, in June, July, we'll be initiating what we call a launch partners program for a select group of organizations that are technically ready and interested in working with us in the pre-launch phase to test and manage our APIs and our services. We'll be working on that. And then we will also, so that Launch Partners program will include a number of different stakeholders, so universities, publishers, some ID systems, and if we can get them a grant organization at this point, so that when we go live in Q4, we will have fully tested the system and may actually have some data in the database for people to play with. All right. That's the schedule. I should go back. Let's see if there's this fabulous arrow. Okay, so Q4 is when we start registering orchids publicly. So you can't get an orchid yet. Well, you can, but it'll get blown away. So when we go live. So you get your orchids in the fall. I want one too. So we're going to go through 3 different workflows for 3 different kind of use cases. One can see where there may be other use cases for publishers, but this is a pretty standard one that this group of organizations is interested in. So the 2 major use cases here, how do we streamline data input and how do we create these author links? So the workflow here is that the researcher will start manuscript submission. That system will ask the researcher, the author, to supply and validate an ORCID identifier. So there's a handshake between the ORCID system and that publisher system. The individual only have to do that once, okay? And if they go to submit into that journal again, they don't have to do the handshake again. That Tier 2 API will pass the identifier and, if so desired, author information into the submission system. That manuscript, not related to ORCID, will be processed, and if it's accepted, the content published. And if that publishing happens, then the metadata associated with that publication and the ORCID will be deposited into Crossref, and then those pairings submitted to ORCID. And through the ORCID record, be available to a number of other systems. Okay? So that's it. The only piece that the individual touches is up there where they have to associate their ORCID with their manuscript at the very beginning. All right, funder workflow. Here, some of the principal benefits: that it reduces the time to complete the application through auto-population of form fields. So that's, from the individual's perspective, a good thing. From the funder's perspective, it creates a trans-organizational record for all grantees. Right now, funders can't, in many cases, even within an organization, don't understand who different programs are funding. This will allow, through that identifier, them to understand who they're funding within and across agencies and organizations. It's a big deal for them. It also provides automatic and verified updates of the scholarly record, and can reduce the award reporting burden through auto-population of outputs-related reports. So when you go in to say, hey, I got this award, and now I need to give my annual grant report, you can use information from your ORCID record to update your report. So here's the workflow. The PI will start grant submission, very similar to publishers. The PI will log into the grant system and will be prompted to add their ORCID ID to their PI profile. There's the system authentication step. Relevant data from ORCID is transferred automatically to the grant application. Again, pending approval by the individual. So an individual can say, look, there's 3 levels of privacy. Let me go into this for a second. 3 levels of privacy. There's public, there's kind of a quote-unquote protected status, so you would share this only with select people, and then private, only I can see it. And so, for example, if an individual is working on sensitive projects, they may choose to select that to only share that information with, let's say, the NIH, but no one else can see it, or with the DoD. So there's ways of holding data in the ORCID record that are visible only by select sharing parties. Grant is reviewed. If it's awarded, that award notice, that pairing notice will be either sent to the PI or the institution, and then the details of that pairing will be submitted to ORCID and the ORCID record updated. So you can see there's kind of this additional step here where that pairing notice authentication of that piece may actually go through an institution instead of the PI. Because in many cases, the award is made to the institution. All right. So lastly, research organization workflow. Here you have an organization that is interested in managing, let's say, an institutional repository, interested in managing profiles, systems that they have, and want some way of automatically updating publications and grants in those systems. So here you have an organization that uses the Tier 2 API to upload basic information for staff members into ORCID to create records for those staff members. The ORCID system will search for possible matching profiles. The organization, we don't have this exact workflow fine-tuned, but either the organization, the individual, or ORCID will be managing collisions. And then that ORCID and profile pairing notice will be sent to the researcher, and the researcher will authenticate the pairing. Okay, so again, the researcher needs to claim the ORCID profile before it goes public. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the HR profile, it could be the Vivo profile. Okay, and again here, similar benefits. You can create a trans-organizational record that travels with them as people move, right? People always move. There's auto updates for publications, patents, and grants, etc. Data sets, one could imagine. Blogs. Management of institutional repositories, and then again, reduced document management workflow for the researchers themselves. And one thing that isn't stated here in any of these, but moving forward, is also the data quality and completeness that we don't have in the system as it stands. All right, I'm going to give you an example of one publisher and how they're working on integrating ORCID. just so you can kind of get a sense of what this looks like. So there are 3 different places here that one could imagine asking for an ORCID. One is when you register, one is when you're managing your account, and one is when you're entering manuscript information. I'm going to go through the registration one. So here you have a registration page, and it says here, do you have an ORCID? Yes or no. If you don't, it'll take you to a create one now. And then the user comes back to an NPG, so in this case it's Nature Publishing Group, with that identifier and is auto-populated into the field. Okay, so you're not actually typing in your identifier, you're using these APIs to move it back and forth. Now, if you do have an ORCID, you can link to your account. Again, you authenticate and approve the publisher accessing your data, which data fields. And then you return the user to the registration page, and then the registration form is pre-populated with the data that ORCID sends back, including your ORCID ID. So it's fairly straightforward. Now, I've shown you workflows, I've shown you schedules. I hope you understand why we think this is a great thing and that it's really going to work. I want to tell you a little bit about what's available now. We've identified the identifier structure. It will look like that via URL. What we have available now is the Phase 1 API, both Tier 1 and Tier 2, and the binary code. That's what's available on the server. The API will call the Phase 1.0 ORCID code base. When we go live this fall, anybody who's tested in that system, the data stored in the server will not be incorporated into the launch. As it says up here, the system is being used now by third parties, including Nature Publishing Group, for integration testing, and the documentation and sandbox server are available at github.com/ORCID. Okay, there's a lot of documentation there. Make sure everybody finishes writing that down. You can also go to www.orchid.org or aboutorchid.org, and all of this information will be there too. So next steps, we are interested in your feedback and on your specific requirements. If there's some workflows that you think would be really great to incorporate ORCID in, or some data types or digital objects that, that we should consider integrating, please let us know. When you go, actually there's this deb.orchid.org site. Everything related to development for ORCID is located there, and if you have questions or suggestions, please post your questions there, or you can contact me directly. And if you need more information, you can go to our website. You can go to Development Tools site. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can sign up for our Twitter feed. You can go to upcoming meetings, or you can contact me. There's a lot of ways of contacting us. Our next outreach meeting, we just had one in March. Our next outreach meeting will be in Berlin in October. I think it's the 17th or thereabouts, plus or minus a day. So if you happen to want to go to Berlin this fall, we'd love to have you. So watch the website, and we'd be very interested. So it should be right around the time that hopefully we're launching the system. We're about to launch the system. So it'll be, I think, a really fun meeting. So thank you very much.
We have time to take a few questions.